welcome everybody to our Delivering Inclusive Microfunding event. We're really delighted to have everybody along today, all the speakers, and to launch our guide as well, which came from lots of learning from Ambition for Age, and I'll go into that more deeply later. So today's event, it's in partnership with Greater Manchester Funders Forum. We were having conversations. We have a collaboration group that's meeting once a month at the moment, and we were having conversations with someone from Greater Sport. So it's really good to have speakers here from Greater Sport, and then also Camden Aging Better, which was one of the 14 partnerships from the Aging Better strategic programme from the National Lottery. And we have some of the people who took part in some of the projects there who've come along as well to be part of today. So I'll just go through some housekeeping first. I think we all know most of this because we're in our third year of online events, but if you can keep yourself on mute and put your video on if you can for now. We are going to be going into breakout rooms later, and it would really help if you could put your video on then. We are recording today's event as well. We've had quite a few people who've said that they were really interested that couldn't come along, so we're going to share the event later. We're not going to have a break, so please do feel free to go and have a break if you need to. What else is there? So the breakout rooms, they will be self-selecting. Depending on which presentation you want to find more out from those people, then please, when it gets to that point, I'll tell you how to select and go into the breakout rooms. Questions, if you've got questions, if you can put them in the chat, we will ask those questions at the end. So we're going to have presentations, self-selecting breakout rooms, chance to ask more questions, and then we'll all come back together and feedback and have questions at the end. Right, I think that's it for now. So yeah, I will hand over to our first presentation, which I'm really pleased to welcome Jo Stapleton from Aging Better Camden. We've got Pastor Noel Adebayo from the Christ Faith Tabernacle, and Elizabeth Ajith from South Sudan Women's Skills Development. So I'll hand over to Jo.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just now going to attempt to share my screen, so please bear with me for a second while I do that. And great. So hello, first of all, I'm Jo Stapleton, and I'm the practice mentor outreach specialist from what was the Aging Better in Camden programme, and I'm now based within Age UK Camden. And I'm here today to share with you how the Aging Better in Camden programme approached tackling social isolation amongst older people from smaller BAME communities. So just as introduction, ABC, Aging Better in Camden, was one of 14 test and learn areas supported by the National Lottery Community Fund to develop creative ways for people aged 50 plus to be actively involved in their local communities. Camden is an incredibly diverse borough with significant health inequalities, particularly amongst residents from BAME communities. Research told us that some older people are at significant high risk of loneliness and isolation, particularly people from African communities. We also found that assumptions are often made about older people living in multi-generational households, about them being less lonely and isolated as a result. And because of this, they often miss out on the eligibility and focus within mainstream services. We also know that to find and engage people from smaller BAME community groups, cultural appropriateness, language, on-the-ground knowledge, and word of mouth to communicate the offer are key. As a result, the take-up of mainstream services amongst smaller BAME communities is traditionally quite low. And when mainstream organisations are not equipped to meet the specific needs of the community, this results in additional barriers to participation. It's a complex process, so it's not as simple as coming up with the magic one activity, which will then enable you to find and meet those people. In practice, the people who are on the ground supporting people from smaller groups, and rather than thinking of these people as harder to reach, ABC identified these groups as underserved. People meeting their needs are often very small community groups, often entirely led by volunteers who lack the criteria and resources to access funding opportunities. So to address this, in 2018, ABC commissioned a partnership of 7 small micro-funded community organisations to find and engage older people from African communities across Camden. This followed learning from a successful ABC partnership with 3 established community groups to reach out to the Bangladeshi community, and within Camden they represent the largest BAME community. The programme worked successfully as a partnership, engaged people via mosques, and also worked with Bangladeshi women. But what we found is we were unable to reach out to smaller BAME community groups. And the reason for this is when we try to kind of broker those relationships and encourage people to apply for funding, we found our funding structure was too complex. The need to tender documents, service level agreements, having a minimum amount of income meant our funding was inaccessible. So we worked with Voluntary Action Camden to bring smaller community groups together and to find a way forward. And the result was a microfunding model. Hopscotch, as you can see there beneath ABC, was one of our Bangladeshi project partners, and they had that fantastic experience of growing from a small community group themselves to a large organisation with infrastructure. So they were well placed to support the partnership. They held the contract and became our intermediary. And via them and Emoja, who was sort of the lead within the partnership of community groups, we were able to provide funding to reach older people. But the key thing was we were able to support those small community organisations to build capacity. The funding in itself was very, very small, so a maximum of 10k per organisation. For many of the microfunded organisations, it was the first funding they'd received because many were run entirely by volunteers. And for many of those organisations as well, it was a first opportunity to focus on supporting older people in their communities. There were many benefits to this microfunding approach. So the barriers to actually obtaining the funding were removed. We were able to reach out to older people from African communities from a place of trust from within their own communities. We were also able to build skills and capacity for our microfunded organisation. So everything from project management skills to volunteer management skills, knowledge of services and support for older people. And this partnership working, this way of bringing people together and having the microfunded model provided stepping stones as well for the older people who were reached to engage and find their way to mainstream services, because we were able to establish a relationship of trust. Before joining the programme, the majority of the older people we engaged had not participated in mainstream organisations before. They expressed a preference to access services offered by people who looked like them, shared similar experiences and language. Something that was very significant as well is many shared with us significant isolation as a result of not having a sense of belonging in the UK, and this feeling of not belonging was often a key barrier to engaging with mainstream activities and services. And many also lived in multi-generational households and experienced isolation. As you'll see from this ladder of engagement here, for the older people furthest away from accessing groups, activities and support, it takes a whole host of stepping stones to successfully engage people. The microfunding model enabled this engagement to take place. As a result of the programme, older people experienced a sense of community and belonging, improved well-being. They were going out more and also increasing confidence to engage with mainstream activities and the wider community. I would now like to introduce you to some of our microfunded partners who very generously agreed for me to interview them earlier this week to share their experience of the impact of that funding, what it enabled them to do, and also some of the challenges they experienced as small organisations. So I'll just play this now.
My name is Chikwaba Oduka. I am the partnership lead on the Camden Elderly People in Action, a partnership of 7 organizations funded by the Big Lottery. I'm from an organization called Umoja Health Forum, which was known as African Health Forum. It's a robust partnership of 13 African organizations providing health and social care in Camden and Islington, addressing both physical and mental health issues in the communities by providing culturally appropriate services. Okay. So yeah, the funding enabled us to build capacity for the organization because for us, this was the first time we had a staff, and this provided stability and continuity. Most of our work, is delivered by volunteers, and the turnover for volunteers is very high. They leave when they get skills and experience for paid work. But we were also able to build capacity, experience, and skills for the 7 partner organizations that, are led by Umoja through training, which was sourced due to the funding we had. So people were able to upskill themselves with report writing, monitoring and evaluation, and project management, to name a few.
Is Elizabeth Ajib, and I've been working with the South Sudanese community in Camden for the last, I can say, 24 years. And we are based in Abbey Community Center in Kilburn, which is part of Camden, London Borough of Camden. Although the funding wasn't that really a big amount. It was like nearly 5,000 or 4,000 a year, but it makes a big difference to us as an organization. We were able to deliver activities which we did not deliver before. Example, like meeting in the park, and somebody has to make food, because when we meet, we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to feel happy. So that funding helped us in that way. In the other hand, we didn't have a paid worker to do the activities. So I do the activities on voluntary basis, and then I managed to have other volunteers who helped me. So the money all gone to volunteering and supporting the older people. The second things we benefit from that funding is we were able to recruit a couple of new people through the project because we were in the park. And if we see or anybody asks us, what are you doing here? We will tell them we are supporting all the people, and we don't have, or we are not ready to meet in a closed place because of most of us are vulnerable. Some have diabetes, blood pressure, and everything. That is why we decided to come and meet in the park. And we will tell them, if you are over 50, please join us. And then we will give them the leaflet. And one time we went there, we find 2 ladies were waiting for us. And they joined us, and we gave them the form. We registered them, we enrolled them, and life carry on.
My name is Noel Adebayo. I'm a pastor in Christ Faith Tabernacle based in Camden. And we are grateful for the funding from Aging Better Camden via Upscotch and Umaja. Now, as a small church, without the funding, we wouldn't have been able to make impact in the lives of the elderly and the vulnerable that we were able to reach during this period. And how did we reach them? For instance, during COVID, they couldn't come out, they couldn't socialize. So we were able to support them by visiting them at home, and we're able to go to the GP on their behalf, pick up their medication, deliver it to them. We also, through the aid of this funding, able to do quite a bit of shopping for them so they don't have to bother or worry themselves as to how this will be done. And so also when the COVID was over, we're able to bring them out and attend our programs. So the physical exercise, physically they are happy and they're quite they enjoy themselves. So without the funding, we wouldn't have been able to do all this. So, for instance, you have to have certain amount of money or handle certain amounts of money before you can even be given a consent form to complete. And most of these small organizations have not handled such amount of money before they didn't have the privilege.
There is a bit of that, and I think, you know, small organizations are not supported enough to stand on their own 2 feet. So it's like a chicken and egg, really, because it's like we're not funded enough to improve our capacity to be able to get funding because we won't have enough reserves. But also, you know, it's impossible really to get any funding if you haven't got the capacity and the reserves. So in a way, we feel as if that is due to some kind of discrimination.
And I'm really pleased to say that Elizabeth and Pastor Noel are both here today and will be joining me in the breakout session. So they are the best place to answer any questions I think that you might have. And thank you to them both for being here today.
My name is Chikwaba Oduka.
So if you would like to know more about the microfunding model we used and also the learning, we have an independent research report that you can download from our website, agingbetterincamden.org.uk, and also the author of the report, Adowa, is really happy for people to contact her direct. But I just want to say one more thing. I think the capacity building that we were able to do as a result of supporting these small organisations was key. And she's not here today, but Chikwaba, who was part of the film, she let me know that as a result of the funding they got, the microfunding, they were able to appoint a member of staff for the first time, build up their capacity and their sustainability, and they've now applied for and successfully received funding on their own account. And she said that would never have been possible without this microfunding from ABC. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, I mean, that's something that kind of came across to me throughout that presentation, and it's also something that we'll echo later in our presentation. It is about that capacity building. You know, it's just so important that it's not just giving someone the money to deliver it, but actually it's everything that's around it that's really important. And yeah, we're very lucky to have some of the organisations here in the panel later on. So if you want to ask them more questions about the process and what was really important to them, or you know, what difference it made having that approach, then pick the breakout room with Jo later on. So we'll move on to our next presentation now. So we're really lucky to have Shirley Hurst and Kay Searcy here from Greater Sport, and Davine Ford from the Manchester BME network. So I shall hand over to I don't know who's going to speak first, but I'll hand over to either Kate or Shirley.
Hi, morning everyone. I'll be kicking off. So I'm Shirley Hurst. I'm Strategic Lead for Partnerships at Greater Sport, and the work that we do across Greater Manchester is really about getting people moving. So we're all about getting people out and doing something and trying to get active and outdoors to improve their health and well-being. So we've had some investment since COVID from Sport England, which we've distributed across Greater Manchester. And I suppose we've been on a real journey with this investment from the start of when we had it, when it sort of landed right at the really tough point of COVID and lockdown, right through to where we are today, and we're still distributing funds. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into the journey we've been on with this microfunding, and also the evolution of having a GM Moving Equalities panel as part of that, and the big learnings that we've had through that, and great to have Davine, one of our panel members, who can give you a bit of insight into that too. So just a really quick sort of update for anybody who's not aware of Together funding. It was originally called Tackling Inequalities Funding, but the whole focus of this fund is around reducing the negative impact of COVID-19, but also that the widening inequalities on active lives. So we saw a real significant increase in inactivity. In Greater Manchester, there was a greater increase in inactivity compared to the rest of England. And it has been sustained. So, there's quite a lot of data out there about whether that's due to longer lockdowns and different theories around that. But the reality is that we had a really significant drop, and people were stopping being active. So we've got quite a bit of data to sort of back that up as well. But the fund really targets the priority audiences, which are just listed there, which again are sort of, the main priority audience that a lot of the inequalities funding around there is. So there'll be no surprises there. What we have found is a lot of intersectionality with the audiences though, so we haven't been as sort of prescribed to say we're funding just disabled people. It might be disabled people who are also in a lower socioeconomic group. So we've had a lot of learnings around that too. You could just do the next slide, please, Lucy. So in the first two phases, this was really about getting the money out as quick as possible, because it was right in the midst of lockdown and coming in and out of lockdowns. So I'm just going to share a couple of the learnings that we found. We went through sort of local authorities, through voluntary sector to distribute the funding in these first two phases. And the main learnings that we had were the people who were coming through were the sports clubs who were trying to diversify their audience, and they sometimes struggled to reach the sort of people that they were trying to. And we had some services trying to, I suppose, expand their funding as well. We did have sort of that time, it was really hard to get introductions because everyone was so, redeployed, and we really struggled to get to people that we really wanted to reach. And also we had quite small pots of funding, whereas we were trying to look at that longer term impact. So that was one big thing we learned going into the next phase. We also, it was very much like a traditional grant. It was complete this form, spreadsheet, we'll put it in, whereas now we're moving more towards that first-hand conversations and building relationship. Another key learning we had was around the digital access and skills with the COVID restrictions, and how some people were struggling with this, especially in Greater Manchester. We had a lot of issues around people not being able to access digital forms or email requesting. So that was just a bit of a whistle stop tour into the learnings of our first sort of getting the money out there. And then I suppose we learned and we moved on to phase 3. So just go on to the next slide, Lucy, please. So phase 3, the criteria, we come out of lockdown, we were sort of looking at more about reducing the negative impacts as a result of the impact of lockdown. So the criteria was about almost like the recovery, phase afterwards that. So we've got it now for up to £10,000. So we made the grants bigger. which was more helpful for the people we're trying to target. And the only other criteria was really around, we wanted to simplify the application, we wanted to make sure that people had a constitution and bank account. But the main thing that we wanted to do in phase 3 was to create this panel approach of people who could really sort of transform this process. So if you want to move on to the next slide, please. So we worked with a lot of different partners to set up a GM Moving Equalities panel. And this was really to accelerate our work to really connect with the representation across the key target audiences for the fund. So we co-designed the criteria and process for distributing the funding. So a lot of changes to the process. It allowed the network of our panel allowed us to promote the opportunity to relevant groups. We now have over 85% of our funding goes to organisations that Sport England and Greater Sport have never funded or worked with before. So it's very targeted. And we're gathering and sharing a lot of learning and evaluation around this approach, which Kay will go into shortly. I suppose it was really about testing a new approach and distributing the funding. And we're learning from the start. So we started with the panel and said, right, how do we want to distribute this funding? And I'll just go in on my next slide to looking at what the panel said. So trusted relationships was a key thing that helped with working as a panel. So the first meeting with the panel, and this is what we heard, capacity funding was really important to the panel, the value of their time and expertise. So that was a real shift. Managing conflicts of interest, because quite a few on the panel sort of had networks, but actually it was managing to make sure that was a fair process too. And actually one of the more transformed pieces was around dedicating more time. So more time was spent with people from the panel, working with people in communities, because that's what they need to be able to get to a point where they can put an application in. So we were really flexible. We didn't have any deadlines. We were flexible about sort of who was available, who was interested, how much time. And we sort of worked with panel members to go out and work with communities and build up applications. So the part of that was a new part to the panel. So we had a panel who made decisions, but also a few members of the panel who actually go out and connect in the community and work with people who may struggle putting an application together or just have an idea, but they've never had funding before. We also increased our support operationally behind the scenes. So we were more flexible in terms of how we received applications. We opened up to receive video or, just a voice recording as well as a Word document. But also we said we're not going to communicate just online. So we've seen a big increase in going to more forums and being a bit more hands-on. Next slide, please. So our panel members, just to give you an idea of the sort of organisations that are involved in our panel, they're all really sort of experts in the 4 priority areas. And I just wanted to introduce Davine, who works for the Manchester BME network, and she's part of our panel. She's been part of our panel for sort of 18 months. So I just really wanted her to just give you an insight into sort of the way that it started and transformed and her experiences of how it's going really. Davine?
Good morning, everyone. So yes, I can honestly say from being on various panels, this has been one of the most enlightening, and from a community perspective, it's been one of the nicest panels to be involved with, because the funders actually wanted to learn and wanted to help people to apply for this funding. And we've seen all sorts of people, from people who couldn't walk, people who did very little movement, get involved now because the application process is so fair and so accessible. So, it's what we do as panels. Yes, we meet when people apply, but as Shirley just said, we also go out to community groups and support them. So it might be that, especially when you're working with diverse communities, they might not understand the terminology. They might not understand how to put together an application. They know what they want to do. They might have language barriers. And, you know, when writing funding bids, people always think there's a certain terminology that people want to hear. But what is good about this funding is that actually we allow people to express what they want to express in the way that they express it. The panel is diverse, so that means that, you know, people can also input at the panel meetings, that actually the groups said it like that because this is what they meant. And this has been a really refreshing panel. It has, you know, people have said, I can't believe that there's only 3 questions, you know, because they expect to have this long application process, you know, and it has been really, really refreshing. It's been a learning journey as well for all involved. And, you know, we have seen a variety of applications, from people wanting to do gardening to get the movement, because people who, you know, up to people who really want to get involved in new sports like walking netball or walking football. So yeah, I will really say this has been a absolutely brilliant panel to be involved with.
Thanks, Davine. And Davine will be joining us in the workshop if you want to dig a bit deeper into that. Before I pass over to Kay, who's just going to touch on some of the sort of learnings that we've had through this process. We've also, you might see on the diagram, we've got 10GM involved in our panel. So we're also working with them as a wider VCSE partner to try and sort of, you know, get the contribution of what services are already there to help people with grants sort of aligned as an extra sort of layer of support for people in communities. So I'm going to pass over, if you pass to the next slide, Lucy, please, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague Kay, who's just going to pick up on sort of what we've seen in the learnings.
Thanks, Shirley. Yes, my name's Kay. I work for Great Sport and I'm the research and evaluation lead, and I've been working with the team to try and capture some of the learning and impact of this fund over the last 6 months. And as Davine said, it's been a fantastic process because we've had that approach in terms of learning. It's been a core part of what we're trying to capture. We're trying to work in a different way, similar to the Camden Age project with the ABCD approach. We're similar in terms of places, our approach. We're trying to challenge the system. And so for us, we're trying to capture all that learning, which is quite complex, but very insightful and been very useful. So this slide is just to represent our last funding phase, which is phase 3. Part of our criteria is to reach untouched, unserviced groups, to try and tackle those inequalities that are experienced across Greater Manchester. So as you can see on the graph, around 45% of the funding in phase 3 actually went to BAME, which can be broken down into further groups of people in the workshops with Shirley and Davine, and then the rest of the funding went to LSEG, and as Shirley said earlier, that with the intersectionalities, actually some of those groups cross over numerous audiences. And then we have our people with long-term health conditions and disabilities. If you could just go on to the next slide, Lucy. And this slide is really just around trying to demonstrate some of the accounts or the impact that the fund has had intrinsically, so with the neighbourhoods and with the people. Obviously with any physical activity project, we'd like to see an increased level of physical activity, which was recorded commonly across all the projects, which is fantastic. But for us, what was really exciting about the projects was the wider stuff around how the groups of communities felt like they connected with new organisations that enabled them to tackle other inequalities that actually exacerbate that lack of activity. As you can see on the quotes, some of the feedback we've got is not all around being physically active, which is fantastic because it just shows you how complex it is to have a behaviour for physical activity, which was really insightful for us to gather that. If you go on to the next slide, Lucy, I am conscious of time. So this slide is around some of the complex stuff that we've been able to learn in terms of greater sport and the work we're trying to do with the panel members and this ABCD or PLACE approach, and some of the key things that we found that have enabled us to have some of the successes that we've had over these last 3 phases. Some of the stuff around involving local people and assets is a core principle, sorry, of ABC or place-based approaches. So obviously for us that was quite easy, integrating people from neighbourhoods into the panel. That enabled us to actually have that insight at a panel level and at an application process point. It enables us to have an empathetic approach in terms of that application decision making. We've got members of the panel that actually represent certain neighbourhoods and communities of Manchester, which is invaluable. And then in turn with that, we need to listen. So another core principle for us was learning and adapting to what is being said. As Shirley referred to in earlier slides, that's been a real key point for us in terms of having that test and learn approach, is listening to the audiences, both the end user, if you want, and the partners, and actually shaping that process and experience to that feedback. And then that has actually kind of led to some further developments in terms of our working across sectors. So we're not just working in our little physical activity and sport bubble. We've been able to diversify that partnership working and connections, which has been, again, invaluable in terms of trying to tackle the systemic inequalities that are exacerbating health inequalities across Greater Manchester. And then I know we're a little bit over time, but we have got some case studies. If you could just go on to the next slide for me, Lucy. I think I'll probably just play the video. So this we've got on screen, there's some pictures from a project called Football for Humanities, which is a programme that looks to use football to tackle health inequalities with a specific group of people, refugees across Greater Manchester. But I think we'll actually just skip that one and go on to the video, if that's okay, just so we've got enough time. If I just share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Hopefully it plays. We shall see. Can everyone see the video? Just give me a thumbs up, Shirley. I can see you.
Just no sound.
There's no sound, but it's, yeah, because it's got the notes bit on it. It's how you've displayed it. It's quite small.
1 second. Oh, I know exactly what I've done, and this is such a rookie mistake. There's something in Zoom you need to do to share sound. 1 second.
You need help? Okay, Lucy, is there anything?
Share sound. Look, I think I've fixed it. 1 second. Oh. Do we have sound? No. Oh. 1 second.
We'll try again then. We might have to. What time are we on now?
Right, it says mine's sharing. Can you hear that?
Benefits for receiving.
Yes.
Yes.
It's a social
Perfect.
thing as well. You know, you do get to meet your fellow neighbours and pass on bits of information and learn things, share experience.
Yeah, yeah.
So she didn't feel healthy and fit, and now she feels good in herself. Yeah.
I think it's probably can we share that with
we
the
can
notes?
share that, yeah.
Yeah.
it didn't quite work, did it? Is it? Have you got more, Kay, or have you?
No, that's the final slide. Sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
I can
Thank
I'll
you.
share that.
We'll be able to share the links to the Together Fund, where we've got quite a lot of learning documents, and also the video we'll share as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Davine, that's really nice to hear. It's most enlightening panel, and you know, a really refreshing experience. That's great. So if anybody wants to hear more from Shirley and Kay and Davine, then pick their breakout room. So it's Sharon and I now, so I'll share my screen, hopefully get this right. I failed at this yesterday. Hold on a sec. Is that working, everybody?
Yeah,
Yeah.
fine here.
It's just, I have flicked it on, but it's just taking its time. Right, okay, so yeah, it's I'm Thea and I'm program manager at GMCVO. We, Sharon and I, are both very lucky to have another 12 months to work on the good practice sharing from Ambition for Ageing. So that's what we're doing over this final year. So Ambition for Ageing was one of the National Lost to Ageing Better partnerships, as Joe mentioned earlier on, for Camden. And there were 14 local partnerships, and there was £8 to £7 million invested in total, trying to understand what really works in reducing social isolation for people aged 50 and over. All the programmes took an experimental approach, and that was really important, especially in this piece around microfunding, because it helped people to make mistakes and learn from it. And that's how we, you know, that was our approach to this final year. So all of the partnerships were working to the same outcomes, but there wasn't a single model. Everyone was different, but there were a commonality of approaches. So all areas recognising the strengths in people aged 50 and over, all using a co-design approach, and all taking a partnership approach. It's on a go slow with, there we go. So, I mean, I'm sure most people know about Ambition for Ageing, but I will just do a brief introduction. So we were a partnership working across Greater Manchester, and we had £11 million of investment in total, and out of that £2 million was invested into microfunding. So we took a place-based approach, and we worked in 25 neighbourhoods, and there are around 12,000 people in each of these neighbourhoods. And our approach to this was acknowledging that it's not about the people that need to change, but it's the places, in order for them to become more age friendly, and that introducing the number of small changes through using a microfunding approach would create more age friendly places and reduce social isolation. So we used a co-design and co-production approach, and over the 7 years worked with 23,000 older people in the design and development of the projects. And our main partners were the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research and Ageing, the University of Manchester, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, MAC and LGBT Foundation, and a whole host of other voluntary organisations across the borough, well, all boroughs. So we work with local delivery leads, and that was in 8 of the areas in the first 5 years. And this was kind of like a Rolls-Royce approach to our microfunding. We had community development workers in each of the areas with support. They had 5 years. They had you know, substantial budgets for doing the microfunding, and they were able to take that time to build on relationships and create networks. And from that learning, we then worked on supporting ageing in place, which was delivered in the pandemic. So let me just move on to the next slide. So from that first 5 years, what we did was we took all the learning and we created a microfunding approach, but from a more centralised place. And what we wanted to do was to understand how, if you are delivering with less capacity, less resource from a central place, how that impacts on some of the aims of this project. And those aims were around using a co-production, co-design, co-creation approach, you know, making changes in the play so that it becomes more age friendly, yeah, just understanding how microfunding, how we can involve lots of older people in the microfunding approach. So we ran a process evaluation to measure our success, and we were very lucky to have the funding from Manchester, the University of Manchester. We had our own researcher who worked on this, and in some ways it was a great success. And Sharon is going to talk about those successes, and there were challenges that we faced too, and I will talk about the challenges. So I'll hand over to Sharon, who will talk about our successes.
Thanks, Thea. Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Summers. I'm from GMCVO, as Thea said. I've been involved in Ambition for Aging for the last 5 years, just over 5 years. So in terms of successes, we were really fortunate, as Thea said, that we actually had a 5-year programme to take a lot of learning from, and we really made sure that the work that we delivered during the pandemic was really embedded in that work, because I think, you know, it's so important to do that. So what the kind of key things that we embedded and that we focused on? So it was really about kind of having older people involved in the co-production and co-design of not only the project ideas, but also the delivery. And that was right through including funding panels as well. And I think the golden threads that kind of ran through all of our work was about ensuring that the lived experience of older people and the voice of older people was completely and utterly threaded through. As Thea said, for the 5-year program, for the 5 years aspects of delivery, that was perhaps easier to do because time was a real thing, and there was time to engage people in the programme, to work with them, to design those projects. And obviously the more centrally based work was during the pandemic and was a shorter time period. The other kind of key things that we kind of fed in was around the Equalities Board and feeding in the learning from the Equalities Board. The Equalities Board was established back in 2016 at the beginning of the delivery of the 5-year local programmes. And that was really set up to ensure that the programme was inclusive and accessible to everyone. And it was based at the LGBT Foundation, and there were workers there, but also it was made up of a panel of older people with lived experience of inequality and discrimination. And really they acted as a critical friend. They did visits, and they kind of really fed back learning throughout that 5 years that we then took into the 2-year programme. Test and learn was kind of really key, and you've heard these terms repeated throughout. I think the thing that test and learn does is it really gives freedom for groups to take risks, try new things, learn from failure, but also as funder, it kind of enables us some freedom to kind of go, do you know what, we're going to fund that. If it's risky and it fails, it's fine because we're going to learn from it. And we also embedded the learning and good practice around commissioning. Again, you'll have heard this morning a lot about removing barriers. So we did that. We really looked at all of the processes from the application process. So we really kind of looked at what do we need in terms of an application form. We actually did still stick with the locally based and also the central one to an application form. We've now sort of moved on and iterated from that, where we don't have to use forms, but we really looked at what's the minimum requirements. We created guidance, easy to read guidance, jargon free, and we were also really aware that not everyone wanted to use written word, or if English wasn't their first language. So we really looked at not having a one size fits all, but a person-centered approach. So we did kind of face-to-face events and a lot of wraparound support that I'll talk about now. The other key thing is, and I can't stress this so much, how significant wraparound support was absolutely built into the design in terms of the centrally based work during COVID. We had Ellie and I, Ellie's going to be in one of the breakout groups. We had 2 workers But we're also really lucky that we were able to fund local infrastructure organisations across Greater Manchester to provide that support. We were really mindful in this work that we wanted to make sure that we engaged those smaller grassroots organisations that hadn't had access to funding, and perhaps really struggled with those kind of difficult processes that could be real barriers in terms of application forms and delivery. So we really looked at support from what was the idea you wanted to deliver right through the application phase, right through to delivery, and also around monitoring. So we kind of had templates around that and workers to support. We were on the phone a lot, Ellie, weren't we, as well, to kind of groups and organisations. I think the main difference between the supporting aging in place work during COVID and the 5-year programme was you absolutely can't take away from the value of community development workers. You know, they're like gold, rooted in community. They know and they have reach into communities and organisations. They've got time to build trust and relationships, and that is absolutely key. Relation approach to commissioning and delivery, you know, that was also really, really important. It's about, you know, small organisations may not have come, you know, may not have been involved in funding before. So it's about being warm, being open. Thea's giving me the 4 minutes max, she knows I go on. Building trust helps to decrease barriers. It also means that it's much more accessible to people, and also about panels. We wanted older people on funding panels, and a lot of older people were underconfident, so it was really, really important to kind of say, ring us anytime. Could you move on, Thea, please? I'll also say that internally to myself. So the next slide, flexibility and inclusion, an inclusive approach really supports successful outcomes in the most challenging times. So it's really about flexibility when delivering work. We delivered the work during COVID, and if you're actually kind of flexible and inclusive, it really gives groups the autonomy they need to channel the funds where they want to and where it's needed most. It's about kind of being agile and pivot. So small groups often have, you know, one volunteer, one worker. So if there's illness, it's about how can we support you to change your model? Are there any other partners? If numbers were low, it was about what can we do around that? So it's about kind of really kind of being open to change, both as a funder and as a group, and being supportive around that. And also inclusivity, it's about kind of, we had really unrestricted funding, so we really wanted to open it up to unconstituted groups. So not a lot of barriers around. Proportionate due diligence was really kind of key. They might have had track records, so we said, what do you need the money for? So there were very few restrictions. Equalities focus, that kind of runs right through all of our programmes from the 5 years through to the kind of the recent work. Sorry, there's a van going past my front of my house that's very noisy. So we really looked at the work through an equalities lens. So what do we mean by that? So it's about recognising that older people were drawn from a range of cultural, social and generational backgrounds, and they might experience different forms of inequality. And so we really looked at it from an intersectional approach, an inclusion approach, and being really mindful that older people, one older person might be a woman with a disability who's a lesbian, so it's about what does that mean in terms of their lived experience. So accessibility was also key. So we used the principles of universal design, looking at spaces and forms, but also jargon free. And we had a kind of we were very clear about our approach, that we wanted to engage marginalised older people from that also included those from low income. So we really looked at how it had targeted rounds, so that allowed greater co-production, and also you know, really trying to focus in all of the work around equalities. And then finally, sustainability. And I know that Jo's mentioned this in her presentation and with the groups. It was really about sustainability and capacity building. I think often with microfunding or with any funding, you can sometimes create more harm. You can go in, give groups small amounts of money, they can be overwhelmed. People think it's the work that's delivered is great, but then when the money goes, it's it's like, well, what's left? So it's really about, we wanted to create sustainability. So the focus was on providing wraparound support to enable groups to have constitutions or develop or access other funding if they really wanted to do that. We ran capacity building workshops around governance, writing documents, networking and training on mental health. And we also, within the programme, built networking opportunities. So our information sessions, we brought people together, we did inductions, we did learning and networking, and we really noticed that groups not only networked within their areas, but also across Greater Manchester. And I think that definitely kind of happened within the local delivery lead work. Okay, Thea, I'm going to hand over to you to look at challenges now.
Thank you. Well, let me just move the slide on. Yeah, so I think sometimes we can learn more from the challenges or perhaps what's not gone quite right. So we wanted to look at some of these. So I think the reach into the communities, you know, although we did work with the local infrastructure organisations, and that was invaluable in reaching out into the communities. I think if we did it again, we would involve them even further at the beginning, like at the design stage, and also we didn't have them on panels, but I think that would have been a really good approach to take. There were some comments afterwards in some of the places, you know, through the process evaluation, that it did feel like some of the usual groups were getting the funding, even though we did work with lots of grassroots organisations. And I think having them on the panels would have added more information about some of the groups that they knew. I mean, there was a particular instance where one of the local authority ageing leads, who was also on the panel, had actually spoken to the local infrastructure organisation before she came to the panel. And there was an application there that it was written by a group that had English as the second language, and it perhaps wasn't as developed as some of the others. It was quite a new group, but she'd spoken to the development worker who said, oh, they're fantastic, they're doing really good work, and that helps that application to get through. And I think that on the ground knowledge is invaluable. So those are that's one of the changes that we would make there. The time, I mean, you know, we were under time constraints. You know, there wasn't anything that we could do about that. The 5 years for Ambition for Ageing for the strategic programmes, you know, that's incredible. It's unusual, but we would recommend a minimum of 2. And especially in some of the places, which I'll go on to next, these are all linked, but in some of the places it just takes longer for projects to get to take off. You know, we found that in places where there was already an infrastructure, the groups were already had funding like this, we could have got rid of all the funding in the first round, whereas others, we needed more rounds. So although we had 2, you know, it would have been beneficial to be able to have that ongoing work so that we could have funded more organisations. And then, I mean, that it is linked to place-based working at a distance, you know, doing that from Manchester, especially when there were constraints around travel. You know, we did go the extra mile. There is a lot of capacity involved in giving that wraparound support that Sharon was talking about. You know, it wasn't just from the local infrastructure organisations, it was also from Sharon and Ellie. You know, there was a lot of time spent with people. But I think that if you have somebody, you know, a community development worker on the ground in those areas that knows the people, the trust is already there. And I think we saw that quite clearly with the local delivery lead work, where there was, you know, an area with a lack of social infrastructure along with a new community development work. I mean, it just took a lot longer than the other places to get groups starting to apply for funding, and also to get older people on panels. So that leads me on to the next point about co-design, co-creation. You know, that was a challenge from a kind of central point. So we built it into the application process, and it was really obvious where organisations hadn't spoken to older people. I think that, you know, having more time would have allowed them to engage with older people in some of that idea development. You know, they could have come to the first round, we could have said, no, you need more input from the older people. They could have gone back and then and brought it again. And I think also on the panels, so I mean, it was great to see, you know, with Greater Sport, with those panels, with I think there's 10, I've tried to count it up, there's about 10 different people from different organisations there. You know, that's fantastic to have that amount of people on the panels, and that's the approach that the local delivery leads took. So it wasn't just 1 or 2 people, it was 5, 6, 7, you know, and I think it's, you know, it's great to have people of experience on panels, but what's the right number is one tokenistic. Is, you know, I think that's a conversation to be had going forward about funding. The constant changing environment, and I mean, that was down to COVID. It was a very unusual time. However, we are working in volatile times, and now communities are very, you know, facing the economic crisis. So I think that going forward, that's a challenge, as people wanting to include people in co-production or co-design approaches. When if you're volunteering for an organisation, you might be facing the people that you work with coming to you with, you know, quite extreme challenges. And so you know, that's something that going forward, I think funders face. And then, you know, limitations around microfunding. I think that we presented to the DCMS yesterday, there was a question around what constitutes microfunding. You know, what amount is it? And ours were up to £2,000. We do some microfunding that's smaller, that's up to 750, and then for some funders, microfunding is up to 10,000, or they call it small funding pots. And I think, you know, Greater Sport was saying they did these smaller pots first, but then actually increased. And I think the feedback that we get from grassroots organisations is that they're constantly having to put bids in for small amounts of money. And that even sometimes when you've got one volunteer running, say, an allotment project, if, you know, sometimes they don't even have time to put in another funding bid, because otherwise they won't be able to do all the rest of the work that needs doing. And I think that's something that we get, you know, we as funders or distributors, of funders, we know that people want more funding for longer, and unrestricted funding, and that's not always possible. But I think it's about that healthy balance on the kind of funding environment. So you have longer term funding with these, you know, the impact that a microfunding project can have is massive. So it's about having the options for the different types. And there was one more thing that I had in my head, then it's just gone straight out of my head. Never mind. I'll move on. It might come back to me in the breakout room, so if you want to come to our breakout room, please do. So just final thoughts. I think one of the exciting things that's happening at the moment, and this is how we linked in with Greater Sport for this event, was that the Funders Forum have got a collaboration group, which has been going on for the past 5 months. And that came from a Funders Forum session last year, where we were talking about how do you get funding to grassroots organisations. So there's about 15 funders and distributors of funding getting together once a month to talk about, at a Greater Manchester level, how do we create more of a collaborative environment rather than a competitive environment. So that's happening. And then we will put the link to the good practice guide and the full process evaluation into the chat. So thank you.